Heidi, and I'm going to talk to you about the solar tachocline and how it changes with time. Now, the sun rotates differentially. We have known of the differential rotation at the surface for a long time, but with UV seismology, we have been able to find the rotation profile as a function of depth, which is the leftmost curve that you see. And you can see that the differential rotation continues in the convection zone, and then it becomes a solid body rotation. And that region, which I have circled, is what's known as the tachocline. And many dynamo models believe that that is where the solar dynamo resides, which is why my collaborators and I have been interested in seeing, does that change with time? In particular, if you look at the middle graph, that is a schematic view of the tachocline. And what I'm going to talk about is that change in rotation rate between the convection zone and the radiative zone as a function of time. So I call that delta omega, and function of time and latitude. So if we go to the rightmost graph, at the top is the change in that rotation, the jump in the rotation for equator, then you go down to 15 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 and 60. And the pale yellow curve shows you it's a proxy for solar activity. And you can see two things. One, yes, the tachocline changes with time. Two, the change does not follow the sunspot cycle. So the question is, what is happening? We do not know. Could I have the next slide, please? So we decided, next slide, yes. We decided to plot this jump as a function of the activity index. And that is where something interesting emerged. Solar cycle 23 followed one scheme, 24 followed another, that's the blue. 25 is following cycle 24, and my hypothesis is 26 will follow cycle 23. I need 10 more years of data. Thank you.
Sorry, struggling with my timer. Go.
So in the solar system, the angular momentum of the sun's rotation is well aligned with the orbital angular momentum of the planets in the solar system, which is mostly in the Sun-Jupiter orbit. So it's now become clear through observations of exoplanet systems, this is not always the case. In fact, it's now been shown that among the hot Jupiters, the most massive planets on the smallest separation orbits, that there can actually be quite a bit of disalignment between the orbital angular momentum of planets and the rotational angular momentum of the Sun. And this is problematic because going back to the 18th century, it's been understood that the alignment in the solar system supports the idea that planetary systems form in disks around their host stars. And so now it's important to try and execute these measurements on wider separation orbits. So historically, the best way to do this is to use transiting planets, because of the bias of the transit technique that's much more effective for small separation systems. And so it's only recently become possible that these measurements can be applied to wider separation systems that better resemble the solar system. And so the plot I have on the slide is an analysis that one of my junior colleagues, Patrick McCreary, has done, where we analyze data from both the Wind telescope and Keck telescope to study the alignment between the rotational angular momentum of a star and the orbital angular momentum of its giant planet at the widest separation this measurement has yet been done. So this is an orbital period of 144 days that corresponds to a separation of about 0.5 AU. And this is the widest separation giant planet system for which this measurement has been done. And what we found is that the system is not aligned. That is, there is a significant misalignment between the rotational angular momentum of the host star and the orbital angular momentum of the planet. And this is we're starting to see that this is related to the occurrence of binary star systems. So this turns out to be a wide binary star system, and this property, that is, this misalignment, is starting to become apparent in wide binary systems. And maybe in single star systems, things really do stay well now.
All right, I'm going to tell you about exoplanets and stellar influences. So this is part of a multi-wavelength collaborated program between HST, ground-based telescopes, and X-ray observations to search for evidence for coronal mass ejections on other stars. So what you're seeing here is an HST COS UV light curve, and you see big flares there. So what I'm going to show you in the next plot is the velocity profile of one of those flares. And what we're seeing here is very large blue shifted emission associated with that flare for the first time. So this fits some of the observational characteristics of CMEs on the sun. So between this and the associated ground-based observations that show this cooler phase of the gas absorbing about an hour later, I think this is reasonable evidence that CMEs are happening on these very young active solar type stars. And then when Heidi told me I had 2 minutes, I realized that I could talk about another project. What happened was because of those big solar events, the big stellar events. And so this is another project that is a secondary eclipse measurement from JWST, measuring this super-Earth planet around this particular M dwarf. And what you're seeing there is essentially that the heat is not being efficiently redistributed on this planet, suggesting that this planet probably does not have an atmosphere and is mainly a bare rock. The take home here is that this fits a larger picture where most M dwarfs actually behave like young active stars for almost their entire lives. And this gets back to the thing that Matt showed yesterday morning about the TRAPPIST-1 planets. And so it's unclear if any of these rocky planets around red dwarfs or any active star can maintain an atmosphere, and that's being tested by the Rocket World's DBT program. And the reason I showed these is that I wanted to highlight that both of these projects were supported by the GEO programs for Hubble and Webb done by early career people. Thanks.
So I'm a member of MMPI of this amazing team called JDISCs, and mostly we're studying protoplanetary disk chemistry, trying to understand planet formation. But since I just had one slide, I thought I would show you some of the beautiful images we get for free because Miriam MRS is an IFU. And so these are two sets of images of two protoplanetary disks imaged in molecular hydrogen. And it's allowing us to study the outflows from young stars. So if you look at the top, you can see kind of maybe a more traditional view of what you would think with your bipolar outflow. And then on the bottom, it's an example of maybe one of the more surprising geometries we're seeing, where sometimes we actually see kind of like a ring of molecular hydrogen. So you can check out these beautiful images. We looked at 34 disks in total. I think about half of them show outflow signatures, and that's work by Mayan Karan, who's a postdoc at JPL.
Okay, so in the last few years, we've been able to show that the metal budgets of dwarf galaxies are dominated and closed by the superclouding medium, the low-density surrounding gas. And now we're able to move beyond the census of metals towards the first measurements of metallicities and diagnostic relative abundances around the mass dwarfs. So the HST image there on the top left, the little smudge with the blue arrow pointing towards it, is a galaxy 8 times less massive than the Small Magellanic Cloud at a redshift of 0.6. The reason that this is particularly interesting is because at these redshifts, we can identify dwarf galaxies and extreme UV absorption features, such as the A-Lyman series and ions of oxygen and nitrogen, shift into Hubble's UV observable bandpass. So this is a typical dwarf galaxy. It's almost our main sequence in the metallicity relation. And now we can measure the relative abundances of nitrogen to oxygen and the oxygen metallicity of the system at 30 kiloparsecs per liter, so well outside of the ISM. This particular system has a higher CGM metallicity by a bit than its ISM, and the nitrogen and oxygen abundance is well below levels that we see in the ISM dwarfs, where we have lots of nitrogen enrichment from HV stars. It is low enough to be consistent with essentially pure core collapse supernova, meaning that this outflow had to escape from the ISM without mixing. That requires very low mass loading, which is the opposite of what's assumed in most simulations of galaxy evolution.
it peaked just a few hours down the road from here. And I chose to focus on this image in particular because a few weeks ago, DESI reached a major milestone of completing its originally planned 5-year survey. And one of my goals in DESI is to create press graphics like the one that you see here. And so, for good look, you should see the slides online. But the different colors represent the different types of galaxies that we're observing, and the enhanced section shows a nearly complete sample of galaxies from just a very thin slice of the sky. And I have to remind people that this is not the result of a simulation, but these are points of galaxy tracing out the underlying large scale structure in just beautiful detail. And so the main science goals of DESI are to measure the growth of the universe, and some of the early results hint that the cosmological constant may not be quite so constant. But these measurements are done with very standard 2-point clustering measurements over a specific range of scales. And one thing we've been talking about here is return on scientific investment. And so my personal research has involved coming up with very creative statistics to take advantage of all this extra information. How galaxies cluster on very small scales, how that's correlated with galaxy clustering on massive scales, and what sort of unique information this can tell us about the fundamental physics of matter, dark energy, and inflation.
All right, great. The work I'm going to be talking to you today about is in Omega Centauri, a unique data set in Omega Centauri of more than 500 Hubble Space Telescope images that were taken in the center because this was the calibration target that we received from the camera. And a heroic effort by a PhD student, Max Haberle, who's now at ESO fellow, to reduce all that data and derive Hubble motions and use this as a time-domain astrometric time-domain data set. And we've discovered 2 black holes as a result of this. The first was a couple of years ago. We found very strong evidence, the best evidence we have for any intermediate mass black hole, by finding stars moving larger than the escape velocity of the cluster if there was no black hole there. And right at the center of the cluster, there's 5 of them, and the chance of that happening is very low. This is stronger evidence than we have for an intermediate mass black hole at any other environment. The other more recent result is the detection of a stellar mass black hole. This is just the 3rd stellar mass black hole measured in a common cluster, the first astrometric detection. And this black hole has a surprisingly low mass of 4.5 plus or minus 1 solar mass. You can see the orbit of it there. It's going to capture only a partial orbit. This is also the longest orbit black hole that we know about so far. Thanks, that's it.